when we set this three-part series up and we had session 1 on June the 4th, that was our listening session. So we had many parents who told us about their experiences with distance learning. They talked about their successes, their challenges, their questions, their concerns. We took that information from session 1 and from online surveys that we distributed as well. And we identified the most common questions and the topics of concern. And those things will be the focus of today's presentation and next week's session. So today, our presenters will be offering information and resources and answers to your questions about specifically designed instruction, compensatory education, extended school year, equity of access issues, and family support. And before each presentation in each agency, I will introduce them. So our first agency to present is the Arizona Center for, it's the Arizona Department of Education, too many acronyms, Exceptional Student Services. So I'll turn that over to Angela.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everybody for having us. I am actually Angela, my name's Angela Odom. I'm the Director of Program Support and Monitoring. And I have a couple of things that I'm going to share with you guys today. I am going to be talking about some commonly asked questions, which will address some of the topics that Kathy mentioned. And then I will also be talking briefly about ESY services. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lori Bird, who's going to talk to you all about some compensatory ed services. So some of our commonly asked questions related to this closure period that we're hopefully exiting as we move forward into next year are the biggest one we get is whether IDEA is still intact, what changes were made, and currently there have not been any waivers granted by Congress. So that means that all of the current laws in place under IDEA, whether it's school age or birth to 3, are all in place at this point in time. So nothing has changed as far as that goes. Because none of that has changed, all of our timelines are still intact. I know that some of the questions that we saw from the question and answer session had to do with whether evaluation timelines were still intact if you had asked for your child to be evaluated, whether an IEP review needed to happen, and all of those timelines are still in place. What I've included here are 2 FAQs from the federal government to allow you to have the links available when this gets posted so that you could go and read and find out more information if you have questions about any of those 2 things specifically. The other thing here in Arizona that had some guidelines around what was happening during the closure is House Bill 2910. So this was a local Arizona state provision that was passed by our state legislature that put into place required educational opportunities. It did not outline what those opportunities had to look like, but it was educational opportunities. It discussed some funding provisions to make sure that schools received funding, even if they had to go to that online type of platform during the closure. And then it talked about school days and required hours, again, around funding. There was a provision in there around students with disabilities. However, because of the federal mandate overrides that and makes sure that those protections and requirements for IDEA are still being met. So I just kind of wanted to include that so that folks knew that there was something in state statute around special education, but the federal requirements are still in place. And again, the link is here so you can go read it yourself if you would like. So were IEPs required to be implemented during the mandated closure? And our answer to that is to the extent possible and feasible and safe. So IEPs were still in place. Students were still supposed to be receiving educational opportunities, as well as potentially their special education services. And so they had to do that delivery as best they could, given the feasibility and the safety of students and staff. So, and those, if for some reason services were not provided, then there has to be individual decision making around whether a child might need compensatory educational services, and those again are on an individual basis. So the question around specially designed instruction and whether what services needed to look like during the closure. Again, this is straight off of our Q&A document on our website, that they should be provided in accordance with IEPs, again, as much as possible feasible, utilizing alternative methods for delivery. So again, we know that during the closure, all schools kind of went to an online type of platform. Some had paper pencil packets. To try to provide that specially designed instruction however they could, given the safety and feasibility of that. Did we have to change IEPs during the mandated closure? And the guidance again that we provided was that they did not need to be changed unless there was a change in placement, again, after school resumes. So we're heading into fall, and by change in placement, we're talking about the definition under IDEA, which has to do with access to typical peers. So not necessarily a change in placement, maybe to a different school or an online platform. It's a change in placement as it relates to your child's access to their typical peers. So we suggested that during the mandated closure, changes really didn't need to be made, again, because the IEP that was in place when the closure happened is still in place, and the child should have received services, again, as feasible through alternative delivery models. This is a resource that I want to make sure everyone is aware of, and again, it links straight to that website, and it's our ESS website where we have COVID information, and we have lots of things there for schools as well as for families. There's the Q&A section that is broken down by topic, and that is updated as we receive additional questions. We're getting less and less of those, but it has been updated a number of times. The other thing that's there are resources for instruction, and those are really there for, it's there for teachers, but also for families. So there's definitely things on there for parents to use and when they're home with their children. We also have the federal and state guidance. That's some of the information that I already referenced, but there are additional pieces of federal and state guidance. Some of the executive orders that have been issued are also able to be located there. And then there's the compensatory service guidance. So if there are questions around whether your child might need some additional services, whether they received their services or not during the closure, there is some guidance there that you can look to see what might be appropriate. So I went through that fairly quickly. I wanted to make sure that I hit the top topics that I know we had mentioned to us throughout the course of the listening session. And so those are the ones that I highlighted, and I highly recommend that you go to that ESS COVID website to make sure that you can look for any specific questions you might have that I may not have touched on. I tried to hit the big ones that had to do with our timelines, whether IEPs had to be implemented, and then what the services needed to look like. So hopefully that gives you some background. And now I'm going to talk briefly about our what is extended school year services. With the compensatory educational services, there's a lot of confusion, and so I'm going to talk about the extended school year services, and then Lori I'll turn it over to her to talk through the compensatory services. So really, what is extended school year? It is special education and or related services that are provided beyond the normal school year or normal school hours. The intent behind extended school year services is to provide a free and appropriate public education. So it is part of the FAPE mandate under IDEA. It is something that would be necessary to enable the student to benefit from instruction received during the regular school year, to prevent any sort of meaningful progress that was gained during the regular school year. So it's looking at whether the child is recouping skills in a timely manner or whether they're showing an extended regression. And the purpose is not to maximize a student's academic potential. Again, this is a very small percentage usually of children that have an issue with that regression or recoupment, and that's why they need these services so that they can continue to make progress in a forward direction. The IEP team is the one that determines ESY services. So this is part of your child's IEP. This is not something that's separate. It would be a discussion that's had at the IEP meeting around whether that regression, recoupment, that thwarting of progress is potentially an issue for your child, and then there would be a discussion about whether ESY services are needed or not. It is determined annually at a minimum. That determination could be changed if it needed to, but it has to be done every year, again, as part of the IEP process, and it is part of the requirements under IDEA. So this is very clearly defined as part of your child's IEP under IDEA. Oops, sorry about that. So how do we determine ESY? It is, again, determined by the IEP team. It is based on the individual student and their set of needs, their set of expectations, how they're moving through things, whether they have that regression and or recoupment issue. Some of the things that are looked at are listed here below. We have academics, social, functional, behavioral skills, things that are going to potentially impact the student's overall functioning. The other thing could be, like I already said, that loss or potential loss without recoupment in a reasonable amount of time that's going to actually make that forward progress unattainable for some reason. Because of the confusion around ESY and compensatory ed services, we've kind of developed this comparison grid. And I know that it may be small on your screen, but this is on our website under that the COVID website that I gave you in the other presentation. And it is under compensatory services. And this really just highlights what the differences are. And Lori, like I said, is going to talk more about the comp services. One of the things that I definitely want to point out is the purpose and the how and the guided by. So as I said, ESY is outlined in IDEA, and then it's further delineated in our Arizona revised statutes as well as our state board rule. Compensatory services are not outlined in IDEA, but it is considered an equitable remedy. So there's a big difference there. And again, because compensatory services are an equitable remedy, there's a very specific criteria around what that's going to look like or when a child might need it. And ESY, again, is outlined in IDEA, and it's part of the IEP. So there's some real basic differences around why we have the two different things and what their purposes are. So some additional resources around ESY. We have an Arizona Technical technical assistance document, which is in the fashion of a Q&A, and that's posted on our ESS website. The links are all included here. We have the ESY versus comp services chart that I just showed you a piece of. And then certainly if you're having difficulty or you have questions around what's going on with your child, or you're not sure how to proceed with a request at the school, you can certainly contact your program support and monitoring specialist that's assigned to your school district. So we do have a specialist that's assigned to each one of the school districts and charters, and they can provide guidance and answer questions similar to how I'm sure our RSK counterparts are answering questions for families. So they are available and can also answer questions in the event that you have them. So at this time, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Lori so that she can talk to you about compensatory services.
And I know, Angela, we've had some issues getting her in. I know my guy is working with her, so I don't know if you want to start that presentation or if Alyssa wants to jump in and do it. Oh,
Okay.
Perfect. Got Lori just in time. Perfect timing, Lori. Just unmute yourself and you're ready to go.
And does she need me to do her presentation for her?
Possibly. Lori, you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
She doesn't have co-host privileges yet. She came in under Angela's, but I'm going to prompt you to unmute. Do you see that, Angela?
I'm unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Go, yes, we can. Thank you.
Lori.
The host had to unmute me. Thank you for the unmute.
No problem.
All right, so let's do a screen share here. We hope. Nope, you have to enable screen sharing for me.
Or I can run it for you, Lori.
Will I be able to see it?
I believe so.
Okay.
Let's see.
Oh, there it is.
If I can.
So you can go right to the next slide. That is just the title slide we have there. We're going to talk about compensatory education. I'm going to take a deep breath and slow down because I tend to talk fast. There, if you listen to the national chatter, you will find that people are wanting to call compensatory educational services many different things, because school districts are feeling like compensatory educational services are a legal remedy when they've done something that's in violation of IDEA, and they've really tried hard during this period of closure to follow, to the extent that they could, their responsibilities under the IDEA. But the word compensate in and of itself is not a pejorative word. It simply means to supply an equivalent for, or to neutralize the effect of, or to provide with means of counteracting a variation. So what that means is a child who needs compensatory educational services needs those services to neutralize the effects of an inability to have provided that student with a free and appropriate public education. Next slide, please. Why are we even talking about this? We're talking about it because, as Angela said, the U.S. Department of Education provided no waivers and no exceptions to the fact that school districts are obligated to provide a free and appropriate education to the maximum extent possible. However, even when school districts fulfilled their responsibilities to the best of their ability during this time of closure, there are occasions where they were unable to provide a FAPE, and therefore district and charter schools will need to make individual determinations for each student with an IEP as to whether compensatory educational services will be necessary. Next slide, please. Who is eligible for compensatory educational services? a student on an IEP who obviously has a disability, and it's an individual determination. However, not all students, even if those students showed some regression, will receive compensatory educational services. And we'll go through in a little more detail as we go on why that might be and how those conversations and discussions might occur with your school district. Next slide, please. So I apologize for the small type. It's a lot of information on a slide, and I don't tend to read my slides out loud, but you can go back and reference these slides after the presentation. The need for compensatory educational services should be determined by looking at the totality of the circumstances for each student, and that includes parental input. In fact, parental input will be a very important component of how a school determines whether or not those services are necessary to put a child back in the position they would have been in had a school closure not occurred. There is no need for a formal IEP meeting. This is a determination that is going to be made on a more informal basis because IDEA, state statute, nor the state board gives a structure or a framework as to exactly how this needs to occur. However, by analogy, we can draw on some of our case law, which tells us that it's a totality of the circumstances, not a minute by minute reimbursement for services that were not provided during the closure. So the school is going to look at circumstances that the student was in, reach out to the parent, ask for their input, and then make a determination of whether services are needed for that student and extend an offer to the parent or explain to the parent why their child does not need compensatory services. Next slide. They're not a contractual remedy. Your IEP is not a contract. It is a program or a suite of services. And when we talk about compensatory educational services, as Angela mentioned, it's an equitable remedy. And equitable is a legal term, meaning it should put your child back in the position they would have been in had the closure not occurred. It's designed to continue a student's fate, but there is no obligation, and this is actually case law, that the school must provide day for day or minute for minute compensation for time missed, nor do they have to provide it using the same provider, in the same setting, or with the same frequency. Next slide, please. So again, this slide is talking about what kinds of information beyond the parental input should be considered. The school needs to look at what services did they provide. And again, parents, you may have been keeping a log of those services. What was the ability of the student to access the services that the school was able to provide? Was the student able to attend? By attend, I mean pay attention. Was the student able to navigate the technology, to use the technology? Did the student have technology, including internet access? Did the student regress on those skills that they were working on in their IEP through their IEP goals? Did they make progress on their IEP goals, or were they flat? Did they not make any progress at all? And then the parental input, where you talk about what that looked like in your home as the student was trying to learn through some kind of distance or virtual learning, be that packets or be that technology. Next slide, please. So if you're given an offer of compensatory educational services, kind of what might that look like? When can those services be offered? They can actually be offered at any time during the regular school day. That presents some challenges if your student, we don't want particularly high school students or any student to be missing important gen ed instruction, but certainly services can be provided during the regular school day. Schools can opt to provide services over school breaks, in intensive targeted individualized programs, or even by outside service providers. So at ADE, we have been encouraging schools to be flexible and creative in developing their plans in consultation with parents so that the student gets what they need without losing something else in the process. If the compensatory educational services are to be provided during the school day, your student's least restrictive environment, that LRE statement on their IEP, cannot be altered. So for example, if your student is in primarily general education courses and the offer of Comp Ed says that we're going to pull them out of all their gen ed courses, put them only with students with disabilities and provide those services in what is commonly known as a self-contained setting, that is not allowed under our existing framework. So they need to try to work around your student's existing least restrictive environment, the contact that they're able to have with their typical peers. Next slide, please. Schools have flexibility and can be creative. I will tell you, there is no prohibition as a parent from you making suggestions to the team or not necessarily your IEP team, that are developing your compensatory educational service plan should your child need compensatory educational services. So please feel free to think outside the box and offer suggestions to your school as part of your input to the school. Next slide, please. Yeah, schools can offer compensatory educational services during the summer. I don't know if any of you that are listening were asked by your school whether or not compensatory educational services could be offered. I know it would be challenging since almost all campuses remain shuttered during the summer, but summer school is a way for compensatory services to be provided. However, simply providing a one-size-fits-all summer school doesn't replace an individualized offer of compensatory educational services. And as Angela noted very well, compensatory educational services and extended school year are not the same thing. Next slide, please. As a parent, you have the right to refuse an offer of compensatory educational services. I have talked to parents, and I know that some parents just want their child to have an easy transition back to either on-campus services or continue with online learning. And they're not worried about compensatory educational services. They feel like their student will just be able to move forward from wherever they are. If the charter or district, that's what PEA connotates, offers compensatory educational services, and you refuse them, you say, you know, great, but I think we'll pass, then your school or charter has met its obligation because they've made those services available to you. That's different than a disagreement. That's simply that you don't want the services. Next slide, please. If you disagree with an offer of compensatory educational services, you can refuse that as well. And you retain all of your procedural safeguards in the event that your child's been denied a free and appropriate public education during the period of school closure. Your rights under the IDEA have not been waived. However, given the uniqueness of this circumstance, given the unpredictability and the fact that none of us know exactly, you know, we're in uncharted territory and on shifting sand, so to speak. The Dispute Resolution Unit of the Arizona Department of Education offers mediation. This is free to both the parent and to the school, and I highly encourage you to learn about that mediation process to resolve disagreements related to compensatory educational services. before you file either a state complaint or a request for a due process hearing. This does not mean that you're required to use mediation, nor does it mean that you're being denied your procedural safeguards. But mediation is a very successful in the past, is a very good way to resolve any disagreement that you might be having with your school district as it concerns your child's eligibility for FAPE. Next slide, please. That's all I have. I tried to give you a high-level overview. Certainly, if you have any questions, you can reach out to ADE, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to Angela, you can reach out to our partners at Raising Special Kids, as well as any of the partners that put together this website. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lori and Angela. Great information. We are now going to have a presentation from the Arizona Center for Disability Law.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Amanda Glass, and I am an attorney at the Arizona Center for Disability Law. And I am sharing my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. So I'm going to sort of springboard off of what Angela and Lori just shared with you. Angela and Lori work for the Arizona Department of Education, so they are a state agency, and they are tasked with interpreting and in some aspects enforcing the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And they have done, I want to commend them, they've done an amazing job of working really hard during a really stressful time to get guidance out to schools and families and teachers about how to try to navigate the laws that exist, as well as the practical reality of school closures and COVID. My agency is not a government agency. We do get some government funding, but we are a law firm that advocates for students and parents. So we do not represent schools. And so my presentation is going to be focused on parents and students knowing their rights during this time. And it's going to include some advocacy tips that parents and students can use. And I want to preface all of it by saying that I understand that this has been an extremely difficult time for families, for school administrators, for teachers. It's been a lot to cope with. And so my hope and intention is that parents and schools will try to work together, will communicate as much as they can for the benefit of children and students. But some of the tips I'm going to give are going to be what you can do if you feel that your child's rights are not being respected or being violated. And so that's the perspective I'm going to bring today. And I am going to try to interpret some of what Angela and Lori shared as well, out of perhaps the legal terms, and try and make it practical for parents who are tuned in. So let me, again, I talked a little bit about what my agency is, but we are a nonprofit law firm. There is an agency like ours in every state and territory across the United States, and we are tasked with providing free legal services to our state's individuals who have disabilities, and that includes students with disabilities who receive special education services. My little disclosure, yes, I'm an attorney, but I am not providing you with legal advice at this moment. I'm giving you some general information and giving some tips that you can use, but to provide legal advice, I'd need to know all the facts of your child's situation, and we need to enter into an attorney-client agreement. So that's not what this is. This is just a general presentation to try to address some common questions and concerns that we have heard. So both Angela and Lori talked about specially designed instruction, and I'm not going to belabor this point too much. This is the same definition that Angela and Lori talked about, but specially designed instruction is what your child is entitled to receive, and it's not the same as response to intervention or lower level tiers of intervention. What it is instruction that is specifically created and tailored to your child's IEP goals. So it's not going to be that all special ed children were in one Google Classroom and got, one piece of instruction that was universal for all of them. That could be the case if they all have very similar IEP goals, but if the instruction that was provided is not instruction that is aligned with the child's IEP or tailored to their IEP goals, it would not be considered specially designed instruction. Like I said, it is provided just to students with disabilities with IEPs. This is different from lower level interventions. Now, that being said, with the school closures and the pandemic, it is permissible for specially designed instruction to be delivered in a different method, and in fact encouraged, because we wanted our students to continue to receive their services even while schools were closed and while it was not safe for students to be receiving in-person specially designed instruction. So if your child's IEP said, for example, they would receive 30 minutes of speech therapy per week, normally it's likely that would have been provided in a school setting and in person, but during school closures, it could have been provided via telehealth or video conferencing or another method. But as long as the therapy or the instruction that was provided is still specially designed and tailored to that child's goals, it would count toward their free and appropriate public education. It means the school has met their obligation to your child. What about work packets? Because we know not all school districts were able to distribute technology or didn't have access to a software or online platform to provide virtual instruction. So what if they were providing paper packets? Well, paper packets, yes, they can constitute specially designed instruction, but the packets would need to be, again, individualized to meet the needs of a student as outlined in that student's IEP. So if the general education teacher is distributing packets to all their students, that's great, and it could constitute a learning opportunity or an enrichment opportunity. But if that packet wasn't specially designed to meet the needs of the child as laid out in their IEP, then it would not be specially designed instruction. It would not count towards that free and appropriate public education. Now, there's a separate requirement that general education opportunities be made accessible to all students. So if you have a child with a visual impairment, for example, and the rest of that child's class is getting a written passage to read, that child should be provided an accommodation such as a Braille version of the text or an audiobook or something that is accessible to them so that they can access that learning opportunity. But if that text isn't aligned to their IEP goals and isn't provided in accordance with their IEP, it wouldn't be specially designed instruction. So those are two separate requirements. All opportunities should be accessible, but only specifically tailored opportunities are considered specially designed instruction. And we did get a lot of questions as well during our listening session and our following survey about paraprofessionals. We know many students with disabilities have in their IEP that they should get support from a paraprofessional during the school day or during certain times of the day. While schools were closed, it may not have been safe or feasible for a paraprofessional, for example, to be coming to your home. So your child may not have received that service during school closures. What the Arizona Department of Education has stated in their guidance is that if paraprofessional support is considered necessary for the student to access that specially designed instruction, and they weren't able to have a paraprofessional while schools were closed, then they didn't get SDI, they didn't get FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, and we're going to have to talk about compensatory services for that child. If a paraprofessional was not necessary, so perhaps the child is at home and because of the change in environment or because of parental support, the child was able to engage, the paraprofessional wasn't necessary, then there may be an argument that the child did receive FAPE even though the paraprofessional service wasn't provided. So everything is very fact specific, and it really depends on your child's situation, but if a paraprofessional is needed for the child to access the curriculum and it wasn't provided, then the child didn't receive FAPE while schools were closed, and we need to look at compensatory services. Another question might have been, who could provide the specially designed instruction while schools were closed? Could it have been anyone, a gen ed teacher, an aide? The rule is that whatever was in your child's IEP before schools closed should have continued during school closure. So if the IEP itself stated that a certain service needs to be provided by a special education teacher, then while schools were closed, that service needed to be provided by a special education teacher. It could have been provided via Zoom or over the phone or in a different way, but the person providing the service should have been the same. On the other hand, if the IEP said that any certificated personnel could provide this service, or this service could come from an aide or staff member, the same would be true during school closures. It doesn't need to be a special education teacher now that schools are closed. It's whoever is in the IEP. So compensatory education, Lori did a really wonderful job of explaining that. So as Lori mentioned, you know, a child will be entitled to compensatory education if they didn't get a free and appropriate public education while schools were closed. So how do we decide if a child is entitled to it? There are some factors to think about, and Lori talked about the legal standard, which is a totality of the circumstances. And that means looking at all the factors involved. What was your child provided a free appropriate public education? And if not, what would your child need to be made whole for what they missed? So these are some ideas of things you can think about ahead of time as parents. Were services provided? So I know many parents have copies of their child's IEP and we're following along. You know, the IEP says my child should get 60 minutes of reading support per week. And, you know, either we did get that or we didn't get that. And if you can think back and look at your child's IEP, you may be able to determine whether services were provided as required by the IEP or not. The next thing to look at is, were the services tailored to your child's IEP and their goals and needs? So were they getting a generic packet that every other student was getting, or were they getting instruction that was aligned to their IEP goals and that met their needs? Another question is if services were provided effectively. So something that we heard a lot in the listening session was, my school tried really hard. They set up a Google Classroom or a Zoom account, and they tried to provide services to my child, but my child could not attend, meaning, as Lori said, pay attention to a computer screen. They refused, or they got distracted, or they couldn't work the technology. For some people in different parts of the state, technology wasn't there. You know, there either wasn't the hardware or there wasn't the connectivity to an internet provider. So even if schools tried to provide services, if they weren't provided effectively for the child, then there may also be a need for compensatory education to be considered. So it's not just whether they made the services available, but did they make the services available in an effective way? So who's going to make that decision? Well, as Lori said, it should be a decision made by both parents and the school. So parents, you have a voice, and it is your right, your responsibility to advocate for your child and think through. My recommendation is to think through ahead of time, what would your child need to be made whole? Do you think your child is entitled to compensatory education, and bring that to the table? As Lori said, this discussion about whether compensatory education is owed and how much is owed and how it's going to be provided does not have to be made at an IEP meeting. This could be a more informal conversation between parents and an administrator, or parents and a special education teacher, and that could work out great. However, it could also be made at an IEP meeting, and there are some benefits to that. One is that your procedural safeguards in terms of how the meeting is run will be in place if you choose to do to use a IEP meeting as the vehicle by which you come to this decision. The other benefit is that from the time you request an IEP meeting, the school, district, or charter has 45 school days to hold that meeting. And that's an Arizona regulation requirement that from the time you request it, they must have that meeting within 45 school days. Now, the Arizona Department of Education in their guidance has strongly recommended that schools try to start gathering regression data and have these meetings within 30 school days, which is sooner and preferable. But that's guidance, it's not binding. And so if you want to initiate a timeline, my recommendation would be to request an IEP meeting, because then you are guaranteed that that meeting has to happen within 45 school days. Or if it doesn't, then you could file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Education. The other benefit of making this decision at an IEP meeting rather than an informal meeting is that all of your child's IEP team members would be involved in the discussion. So for example, if we're talking about speech therapy and you sit down with your school district special education director, that person may not know your child, may not know your child's needs or progress or goals. And so it would be beneficial, if we're talking about compensatory speech therapy, to have your child's speech therapist at that meeting. Now that could happen at an informal meeting, but if you have it as an IEP team meeting, all those required team members will be there. You'll have an administrator, but you'll also have a special education teacher, a regular education teacher, and individuals to interpret results. You'll have a seat at the table. So that's one other benefit. My organization, the Arizona Center for Disability Law, has created a template letter that you can use to request an IEP meeting to discuss compensatory education. I was going to post it in the chat box, but I can't figure out how to minimize my screen. So I'm gonna just say that we will make sure it's embedded, just as Angela's was, it's embedded in the PowerPoint. So you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint with our follow-up email in the next few days, and you can click on it then, and it'll take you to this template letter you could use to request an IEP meeting from your child's school. So once the meeting is scheduled, whether it's an IEP meeting or an informal meeting, what can you do to prepare? So my recommendation is that you gather data and you bring that and be ready to discuss it at the meeting. So think through, how is your child doing before school's closed? Were they making progress? Thinking especially about their IEP goals. Were they making progress toward those IEP goals? One piece of evidence you might have about that is their progress reports from their schools. So schools are required to issue not only report cards from the general education setting, but progress reports about your child's progress toward IEP goals. So if you have that from Q3, that would be something to look at to see how close were they to meeting their annual goal before schools closed. And then evidence that they've regressed while schools were closed. So while schools were closed, did they slide back? Do you have video or audio recordings of things that were happening while schools were closed? Do you have work samples of things they worked on, whether it was from distance learning or something you provided in the home? Do you have examples of maybe how their progress toward their handwriting goal for occupational therapy, they've regressed on it, and you could bring a work sample to show that, something like that. Anecdotes, having hard evidence is great, but sometimes just your stories, and if you take the time before a meeting to think about what happened while schools were closed, what are some anecdotes you could share during these meetings? And then formal measurements. So perhaps when schools reopen, the school will perform some kind of assessment on all students to measure their current levels. That might be something that you could use as part of this meeting as evidence, either that they've progressed or regressed. You should also look at what was or wasn't provided, as we discussed. Look at their IEP and what they were supposed to get, and then think through what they were given while schools were closed. The other thing to do, and Lori touched on this, is you should think through, what do you think would help put your child back in the position they would have been in but for school closures? Do you have a program in mind? Is there a particular service you think they would benefit from? As Lori said, compensatory education doesn't have to look exactly the same as the services they would have gotten in school. It could be instead some sort of intensive program, a camp, a therapy, a provider. If there's something you're aware of that you think would benefit your student and help address the regression that they've experienced because of school closure, bring that to the table. There's no guarantee the school will agree. But you can come with ideas and the school can listen and consider them and sometimes agree that that is the best way to address your child's regression. So come prepared to these meetings. It's not your job to fix this, but if you come prepared and you have thought through what might help your child, you will have more success in advocating for them when you get to the school. The other recommendation is to get whatever the plan is in writing. So again, the Arizona Department of Education, they've provided a letter template that schools can use when they've come to a decision about compensatory education. And it will say how much, how many minutes or hours. It will, if you've selected, let's say, an intensive week-long camp, it will identify that camp by name and say that the school will be funding your child's attendance at that camp. It will lay out who's going to provide the services, when they'll be provided. And so that the school could put it in writing using that template letter. They may create their own template or document they want to use. They could use a prior written notice document, which is something many of you will be familiar with because it is used whenever a decision is made about the provision of FAPE, whether to make a change or reject a parent's request. It will be put in a prior written notice document. So compensatory education could be documented in that same way. It is separate from the IEP, and I know Lori and Angela said this, but I just want to reinforce, schools can't say, okay, well, we'll just double everything for the next 6 months to make up for what was missed. We'll take your child's IEP from 60 minutes of reading to 120, and we'll do that. The IEP is what your child needs to get a free, appropriate public education going forward. Compensatory education is backward looking. It's what can we do to make up for what was lost. And so it should be a separate document. It shouldn't be incorporated into the service minutes in the IEP because they're two separate considerations. Especially for some students who may be coming up on a big change in schooling. For example, they're going to age out soon or they're going to graduate soon from high school. They may still be entitled to compensatory education, but the way it's going to be provided needs to be thought out, because if they're leaving the district or charter, if they're moving states, if they're going from preschool to elementary school, we're going to have to think through how we will effectively deliver this compensatory education. The other thing that Lori touched on, and I want to reiterate, if we are talking about delivering compensatory education during the regular school day, we need to be really careful that we are not changing the child's least restrictive environment. So again, if your child spends most of the day in general education, but gets pulled, a couple times for certain therapies or support, and the school's recommendation is to move them to a self-contained class and knock out all those comp ed minutes, that would not be appropriate. And I also recommend that you talk to the school about how this is going to impact your child's access to other parts of the general education curriculum. So if the school is proposing, well, we'll pull them out of their specials class to give them the comp ed, that may be permissible if you agree with it, but the child, is then missing out on their enrichment class. So it's something to think through and to discuss, and your child is still entitled to participate in and benefit from all aspects of general education, even though they are owed this compensatory education. So after you've had the meeting, you've talked to the school, you've come to an agreement about the type and amount of compensatory education that your child is owed, then what do? My recommendation would be to track the provision of it. So if everyone agreed your child is getting 200 minutes of comp ed, make sure that you know when it's being provided and how often it's being provided. If a session has to be skipped, make sure you note that so that you know when it's all been provided. And you can track it and say, I think my kiddo is still owed 60 more minutes. Where did that 60 minutes go? Keep on top of it so you can advocate for your child. Lori mentioned if you don't agree with the school and what they offer for compensatory education, you do have your dispute resolution options. And again, like Lori said, I also encourage you to try and take advantage of mediation and these informal options, because once things get contentious, it can be difficult on everyone, the school and the family. So to the extent possible, using informal dispute resolution options such as mediation is encouraged, but you as parents do have rights, you have procedural safeguards. So if you want to learn more about the different dispute resolution options that exist, there's a link here to a blog post from my organization's website where we go through each of the different dispute resolution options. So you can learn more about what those are and how to engage in them if you need to. Something else to think through after the meeting. So we know all kids have been impacted by this, and it's gonna affect every single child in our world. We want to address what they were denied through compensatory education, but it's possible that your child's entire needs and their needs going forward have changed because of this. If you believe that is the case, it's not just, oh, they regressed because they weren't in classes. It's their disability. They may have another disability. They may have experienced trauma or gone through something during this closure and this pandemic that has actually changed their needs going forward. You may want to talk up to their IEP team about conducting a reevaluation or looking at if their IEP needs to be amended going forward. Are their ongoing needs different because of the school closures? Now, again, remember there are two different considerations. Compensatory education is for what was denied, but a change to the IEP means we think the child's ongoing needs, long-term needs, have changed. And it's possible for some that they'll have both. Some will just be one or the other, and some might be neither one. But those are things to consider. And then the other thing to think through at this point, we're getting close to the end of the summer already. How will compensatory education be provided to your child if in-person learning is still not safe for them? So some schools, and we will learn more about this at our next session, so I'll do a mini plug for next Thursday. We are going to hear from either 5 or 6 different local education agencies, meaning districts and charters, about their school reopening plans and how they plan to deliver specially designed instruction to students with disabilities. But many schools have publicly announced that they will be offering a variety of options. So in-person brick and mortar schooling, only online distance learning, or a hybrid of the two. So if you have a child who is attending a school that isn't going back to in-person at all, or if you personally feel or your child is medically fragile and so it's not safe for your child specifically to go back to school, how could comp ed be provided to them? If part of the problem was we couldn't deliver a free and appropriate public education while schools were closed, how are we going to do it now that school has started again, but brick and mortar campuses aren't open or aren't safe for your child? So that's something to talk through with the team and to think about. You know, if your child is someone who really needs in-person services, you may have to talk through whether the provision of comp ed could be delayed. until it's safer, whether it could be provided in a one-on-one setting off campus or in your home. Again, the school and parent would both need to agree to any of those, but we may have to be creative. These are very strange times. So when you're in the meeting and you're talking to the school about whether this amount of compensatory education is appropriate, the right time, there are a lot of factors to think through. And again, there's a link here to a blog post that goes more in depth on each of these. But I just want to point out that, you know, Lori said it's not a one-for-one standard, meaning if your child missed, you know, 1,200 minutes, it doesn't mean they're going to get 1,200 minutes necessarily. So when you're weighing an offer made by a school or you're thinking through what would be effective for my child, think through some of these things. What's convenient for you, for the school? Is it going to impact transportation? What about intensity? So maybe they missed out on their group instruction, and that group instruction was 15 minutes twice a day, but now compensatory education is being offered in a one-on-one setting, and it's being offered 5 hours straight. And assuming that that's appropriate for your child, that intensity might mean that you're willing to take less time overall, but you're getting more intense services that might have a greater impact on your child. Think about time of day. Does your child function better first thing in the morning or after school? And if the school's offering after school comp ed, is that even going to be effective if your child's exhausted by the end of the day? Or would it be better for your child because they finally start to perk up after 3 p.m.? So think through your child's individual needs. Again, effectiveness, maybe they're offering, like I said, group versus one-on-one. Special education teacher, maybe normally your child gets a service from just a staff member, but the school's offering that the special education teacher will provide it. So maybe you view that as more valuable. And again, especially for our students who are about to experience a big change like graduation or changing schools, the flexibility of the offer that's made is something you're going to want to consider. So once again, there's a link here that takes you to a blog post that has more information about each of these factors that you will want to consider when deciding what compensatory education is appropriate. So I'm going to go through, that was comp ed, a lot of comp ed. Now I'm going to go through just some of the questions that we got from the surveys and from parents during listening sessions, and I will do my best to answer them. A lot of these things, as a full disclosure, we don't have perfect answers because this is new territory, but I'm going to do my best to answer with the knowledge we have. So face masks in schools. We heard from a lot of parents. What about students with developmental disabilities or hearing impairment who need to be able to see lips or see facial expression to communicate? What about students who need speech therapy and need to be able to see their therapist modeling something with their mouth? And what about students who have sensory needs and can't wear a mask themselves? How are we going to cope with all of that? So the first thing I will say is that if a student has a disability-related need and they need an accommodation related to masks, they are protected under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you don't necessarily need to put something in their IEP about an accommodation. You could, but regardless, if it's a communication barrier and an access to education issue, they are entitled to that reasonable accommodation. Now, schools are going to need to figure out how to navigate both keeping all students and teachers safe while also accommodating those students. So that might mean speech therapists are equipped with transparent masks, so their transmission of COVID is reduced, but their lips are visible. Or some of those transparent face shields that cover the whole face. And that may work for teachers. And then what about the students who have sensory needs? So there's different ways that that could be addressed as well. My recommendation is that, you know, all children's needs are individualized. So communicate early and often with your child's school. If you know already, like you've tried the mask thing and your child rips it off or has major behaviors, and you just don't see how that's going to work, start talking to your child's school district now and say, I'm really concerned about this. Can we talk about this? What plan can we come up with as a team, parent and school, to keep my child and other children safe, but also accommodate them? So start having those conversations sooner rather than later. And then you can think about some ways you might try to address this in the IEP. Adding social stories to the IEP about why wearing masks is important, or other things like washing your hands, keeping 6 feet apart. All of that are things that could be built into the curriculum or built into your child's specially designed instruction. Another question we got a lot was about socialization. And, you know, again, this is going to be sort of a worldwide issue. How can we socialize when it's not safe to be with other people? We know students with disabilities under federal law are entitled to be educated in the least restrictive environment appropriate to their needs. So if they were in a setting where they were able to socialize with students without disabilities, they should be provided that to the extent safe and feasible. So some ideas, virtual specials, like if they used to go to the gen ed music class, maybe now they can join virtually if they're at home, that gen ed music class. Now, if everyone's in person, there may be other ways to accommodate that. But I'm thinking if we're continuing in a distance learning model, how can we make sure that our students with disabilities still get to socialize with non-disabled peers? So virtual specials, clubs, or extracurriculars, you know, sports might be difficult, but I think schools will be very creative in coming up with ways to keep students engaged. And if your child has a disability, advocate that they be entitled to participate and not, you know, not singled out or segregated on the basis of their disability. Again, placement and least restrictive environment should remain the same. So if you have, let's say, a medically fragile child and brick and mortar schools are open, but it is not safe for your specific child to go in, the virtual opportunities or remote opportunities that are provided to your child should reflect the least restrictive environment in their IEP. And again, you're going to want to work with your school to figure out the best way to do that. That's my third bullet point. Communicate early and often. Start talking now to your child's IEP team, special ed director. We're having this statewide forum, but I know many school districts and charters are having their own forums or sending out surveys to parents, rolling out reopening plans. So reach out to your specific child's school district or charter to get more information. Finally, one issue that we've heard about is the issue of parents being at home trying to support their students with distance learning. But struggling because the parents don't know how the technology works, or the parents aren't being provided any support, especially in their native language. So for non-English speaking families, this has been a big challenge. Now, I'm telling parents that if you are in that situation and you feel that you are not being communicated with in your native language or in a way that's effective for you, know that under the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are only some documents that have to be provided to you in your native language. And those are very specific. But there are other laws that protect you. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act requires that federally funded programs provide meaningful access to non-English speakers. And that includes, for students, documents related to their special education program and their regular education program. These are vital for parents to understand their children's education plan. So if you have, and again, I always recommend informally try to resolve disputes, reach out, email, call, try to get in touch with your child's case manager, special ed director, and resolve this informally. But if you can't, and if you're continually denied access to understanding your child's education in your native language, you have the right to file what's called an OCR, Office for Civil Rights complaint, with the US Department of Education. This is a federal law. So this would not go to the Arizona Department of Ed, it goes to the US Department of Education. And again, there's a link here. There's really user-friendly instructions on the website. And so that link will be included for you. That is the end of my presentation, but I put up our information here. If you are experiencing difficulty with your child's school, my recommendation is to first reach out to Raising Special Kids, because they can help you understand your rights, understand the law, and move forward. But they may refer you to us, or if you feel very strongly you have a legal claim and need to talk to a lawyer, you can call our office, and our number is there, as is our website, and we do conduct intakes Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Amanda. Our next presentation will be from the American Civil Liberties Union.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Diaz. I am a native of South Phoenix and an organizer with the Demand to Learn campaign that is part of the ACLU of Arizona. I will share my presentation in a moment. That I will focus on the inequities of access to technology and support that families have faced during distance learning. So a little background about the ACLU. We are a legal and advocacy organization that seeks to preserve and ensure constitutional rights and principles found in the Bill of Rights. The ACLU of Arizona principally addresses issues involved challenges affecting the constitutional rights, that is, the civil liberties and civil rights of people most impacted by injustice in Arizona. So I wanted to start off my presentation by sharing that under Arizona Constitution, students have the right to enroll in public school and public education. And I added an excerpt from Brown versus Board of Education that states, education is a right that must be made available to all on equal terms. And so when we got hit with the global pandemic and our schools acted quickly to ensure the physical safety of all students, not all schools were able to make remote learning available to all on equal terms. And so the ACLU of Arizona, we have identified 4 major equity concerns prompted by remote learning. Well, all of these issues were identified during remote learning. They may become an issue again if or when we return to remote learning. This may also be issues for students whose families do not feel safe sending them back to school, or if they are at high risk and may need to continue learning from home in the fall. In the next slide, I'll go more in depth, but in short, these are the 4 top concerns. Number 1, access to technology. We want to make sure all students have access to even participate in remote learning, right? We want internet, routers, modems, laptops, even printers. In the next slide, I'll be talking more about language accessibility, which also plays a major role. We want to eliminate disciplinary practices like suspensions during school closures and offer educational opportunities to all students. We did hear of a student that was given a suspension before spring break, and after spring break, they had a scheduled meeting and they still were suspended, even after the school was closed. And so the school excluded the student from receiving educational opportunities, and this is exactly what we want to avoid. We are also seeing the need for more mental and behavioral services for in schools, but we also want to make it accessible during remote learning. And just so you all know, Arizona has the nation's worst student to counselor ratio. And lastly, ensuring privacy protections when students are engaged in remote learning. It's been in the news that Zoom has been targeted by hackers to interrupt and disrupt. And we just want to ensure safety when students are relying more on technologies that could potentially cause harm. And so I want to share examples of how these issues affect real students and families in Arizona. The most common barrier is lack of having a laptop and Wi-Fi. We have heard of students and families that have multiple users using the internet for remote learning and the Wi-Fi slows down. We have heard of families and students that live in areas that internet companies do not reach. We have heard of no technology for speech and language therapy, mental health services, or even sign language interpreters. Another major issue that was brought up almost all of the time with non-English speaking parents is language accessibility. Parents and caretakers deserve the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the student's education and assist them in completing and understanding assignments like any other parent or caretaker would. So these denials are a form of discrimination that deprives the students from an educational benefits and equal educational opportunity under federal law. This is why we are advocating for schools to take necessary steps to ensure equal access to all educational opportunities, whether the child is an English language learner or not. Language translations for all educational opportunities and curriculum should be provided for the family and caretakers. And for the lack of mental and behavioral health services, we are raising awareness on the benefits of increasing support in our schools. And we want to highlight that this relates back to the access of technology as we advocate for students to be provided with adequate technology that can be used for mental health services during remote learning. And then lastly, the lack of privacy has to do with cybersecurity. And our understanding is that several websites and tools that have been used for remote learning are collecting data from students and families' computers that include search terms and other information. So we just want to ensure that there's safety for all students and families. So we want to uplift the students and families that experience perhaps all of these issues, right? And now are behind their classmates starting in fall. We want to advocate that these students and families be provided additional assistance so that students are able to catch up and are not permanently disadvantaged because they received a very unequal, if any, education for the months that their peers were receiving remote learning. So I want to go back a little bit and remind you that I am an organizer for an education equity campaign, working closely with youth, parents, amazing educators, and allies. And we are working in conjunction to advocate for ourselves and encourage others to also participate in advocating where it's appropriate. And I want to share quickly that we have been working on this, before even COVID. I want to share a little bit about our Demand to Learn campaign, which is focused on racial disparities in discipline, exclusionary and unlawful enrollment practices, and lack of student services like counselors and social workers. We have goals of advocating at the local level with our school board, principals, community members, and also at the state level, talking to legislators, talking to our representatives, and seeing how we could impact change in both advocacy and policy. We want to dramatically reduce suspensions, advocate for more counselors, right? And have a fair enrollment process. And so we range from folks that are youth to parents to educators, and we're all committed to reform policies that push students out of school. And while we still are under COVID, we are about a month away from schools opening. We are still continuing our efforts to advocate, both in what has been impacted after COVID and the racial inequalities that had been happening before COVID that now are becoming even much more important to talk about. And so I wanted to share quickly that we are addressing ways in advocacy and in policy, right? I wanted to share with y'all that, my important goal is to empower and train youth, parents to know your rights and advocate. Just like Amanda Glass just presented, we want to encourage more of those presentations, more youth leaders to also participate in discussions, and have folks also participate in local politics, right? And encouraging folks to just participate in creating change, sharing your story, and advocating for what is fair. So now I am on my last slide. If you have learned something new, thought of an idea, or are curious to meet us and learn more, please contact me. My name is Cynthia Diaz. I'm the Demand to Learn organizer. My email is right there. And I listed a few examples of how you could get involved with us. We value the perspective and experiences of folks most impacted by inequalities in schools, and folks that are passionate to push for equitable policies.
Thank you, Cynthia. Our next presentation is from the Native American Disability Law Center.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate everybody spending the afternoon with all of my colleagues here today. I am Alexis Delacruz, and I'm a staff attorney at the Native American Disability Law Center. I have not prepared a formal PowerPoint, but I do encourage folks who are interested in learning more about our organization or even contacting us for services to visit our website. And my contact information is listed on the PowerPoint that is that you're all looking at right now. I'm going to talk briefly about what the Native American Disability Law Center does, some of the unique legal issues that face our client community, and some advocacy tips for families who might be joining us today, or stakeholders or other interested parties who are working with Native American families who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So much like my friend and colleague Amanda Glass at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, the Native American Disability Law Center is a sister organization. We are a protection and advocacy organization for Native Americans with disabilities who live in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. So we are very unique in the sense that we are the only Native American P&A in the country. However, we do not provide legal services to Native Americans living anywhere in the country. Folks have to live in the Four Corners region, which does include northern Arizona. So some of the things that I really appreciate with what Ms. Diaz highlighted in her presentation are the issues that we are also seeing in Native communities, and they've actually been compounded for families who are living on particularly the Navajo Nation and the Hopi communities, as well as in New Mexico, because we do provide legal services to Native Americans in New Mexico as well. So the rural nature of those communities have impacted families' ability to access technology. So there has been concern with education equity because families just were not able to access the internet or have computers or tablets or laptops provided to them. One of the things let me just take a step back and ask a question of the parties. How can I minimize the PowerPoint that I'm seeing so I can look at my desktop? Never mind, I did it. I got it, thank you, I apologize. So the Native American Disability Law Center does serve families that that have their students enrolled in Arizona public schools. However, our organization focuses on addressing the unique needs of Native American students with disabilities and their families who attend Bureau of Indian Education schools. And because I have limited time this afternoon, I am just going to give a brief overview for folks who might not be aware of this education system. It is one of 2 federally run education systems in this country. The other federal school system is the Department of Defense schools that provides education services to children who are related to service members. The Bureau of Indian Education is a federally run program. It falls under the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior, and they are tasked with providing education services to Native American students. They operate around 183 schools around the country. Most of the schools are located on federally recognized Indian reservations, although that's not always true. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but the recitation that the Arizona Department of Education provided, it's our position that all of those rights and responsibilities that they articulated for students who attend Arizona public schools are also available to Native American students who attend Bureau of Indian Education schools. So if there are folks on this call today wondering, well, my student is in a BIE school, I wonder if my child has those same rights. Our position is that yes, he or she does have those same rights. And a lot of the advocacy tips that have already been suggested and promoted here, we would also emphasize for students in BIE schools. So just going back to some of the equity issues that we've been hearing from families the last couple of months. And again, I'm going to just focus on students who are in the BIE system, just because we've already had quite a comprehensive and a really excellent presentation from my colleagues about the state of the public school system. To date, the Bureau of Indian Education has never published formal, publicly available guidance to its schools about how it should be meeting the needs of any student, much less students with disabilities. And obviously that's very concerning because BIE schools have been struggling to understand their obligations and to provide services to students without having formal guidance. And much like the Arizona Department of Education is the state educational agency for public schools located within the state of Arizona, the Bureau of Indian Education is the state educational agency for its schools. Our organization, along with the support of around 50 other organizations around the country, including many of the organizations on this call today, submitted a letter to the director of the Bureau of Indian Education on April 20th, asking that the BIE issue formal guidance because of the education equities that we were seeing compound after most of the schools closed around mid-March. Families were not being communicated with about how the schools were going to better understand what student needs were, how they were going to provide services. Surveys were not sent home to understand how families needed to receive communication, what the language abilities were. And so as a result of that, many of our students who are attending Bureau of Indian Education schools received 0 educational opportunity after their schools closed related to the public health emergency. If students were able to avail themselves of educational opportunity, it was usually happening because a teacher reached out to a family, or you know, it was sort of on an ad hoc nature. There was no really consistent plan. And so our concern is that many of our students received no educational opportunity, and so are going to be further disadvantaged as we look towards schools reopening in the fall because they didn't receive any service. Again, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and I just really, if there's one takeaway that I hope to leave you all with, is that students attending BIE schools have the same rights available to them as students in the public school systems. So even if your student is attending a BIE school and he or she did not receive any educational service, it's our position that the school does have an obligation to provide that student with compensatory education. And much like Amanda Glass with the ACDL just laid out, we would be suggesting the same types of advocacy strategies to address your concerns, primarily by documenting in writing what efforts were made to contact the school, what communication, if any, families were able to have with their school during the closure, requesting an IEP meeting in person to begin having initial conversations about what services the student may require to bring him or her back to where he or she should have been if they had been provided services. One of the other, I think, unique issues that is facing Native American families during this time is the significant trauma that many families are facing right now, given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Native families. And many of our families and clients have told us that right now they are really focused on safety and health and well-being, and addressing those immediate needs, and that right now education advocacy, while critical and very important, has taken a bit of a backseat as families are taking into consideration basic survival needs. And so what the Law Center is going to be advocating for is that the BIE schools are implementing trauma-informed practices to meet the needs of its student population as students are coming back to school. Right now, we're hearing from families that students are really afraid to go back to school, and potentially, you know, contract the viruses. I think that's not unique to the communities we serve, but it is something that we're looking to the BIE to take consideration of in meeting student needs, is that many of our families might have had a direct impact with the COVID-19 and need to take into consideration the needs of those students and the traumatic impact of the experiences they've had these last several months. Also, our families and our communities are historically underserved, and so we remain incredibly concerned about how far behind Native American students attending BIE schools will be, even compared to their similarly situated peers who might attend an Arizona public school right across the street, because there was no formal plan in place about how those students' needs were going to be met. Something that is really critical, tomorrow, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to be releasing its COVID-19 school reopening plan. And so they are planning on doing tribal consultation and public consultation to hear from families about what school reopening should look like in the fall. And so if folks are interested in providing public comment or sharing their experiences with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as they look to develop a comprehensive plan about school reopening, I encourage folks to go to BIA.gov, and you can find links to how to register for those consultations and to review the draft plan. And if you're unable to find it but are interested in providing comment or learning more about what the school reopening plan is, please feel free to reach out to me or my colleagues at the Native American Disability Law Center, and we'll happily make those connections for you, because we do think it is critical that the federal government hear from families, students with disabilities, key stakeholders about the impact that the school closures have had on families and what any school reopening plan would look like. And in just wrapping up, I do want to make one key distinction with the BIE system. As I had mentioned, families have the same rights and schools have the same responsibilities to students in the BIE system as if they were attending a public school. If your child or you're working with somebody who's attending a BIE school and they want to file a complaint similar to or avail themselves of some of the dispute resolution procedures that my colleagues have presented, you do not do that with the state of Arizona. It's a little misleading. Any complaint does have to go to the Bureau of Indian Education itself. The state of Arizona doesn't have any jurisdiction over the Bureau of Indian Education. So if you believe that your rights have been violated, or you would like to try mediation or file a state complaint pursuant to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, those complaints and requests go to the Bureau of Indian Education's Division of Performance and Accountability, which is located in Albuquerque. The BIE's website is bie.gov, and they do have links to how to access that information. But again, if folks have questions and would like to contact us directly, the contact information is there, and we're happy to talk to folks who might have concerns about what their student did or didn't receive and what the impact on that student will be moving into the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. And our next presentation will be from Raising Special Kids.
Thanks, Kathy. I just want to do a mic check. Can somebody confirm you can hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Tiffany, and I'm the Executive Director for Raising Special Kids. And thanks for having me on. I would like to thank everyone that's gone before me with all of the great information, the strategies and tips, the common thread of communication. I'm here to kind of close us out and talk a little bit about family support and just some general perspective on the COVID crisis and thinking about going back to school. So at Raising Special Kids, our mission is strengthening families and systems of care to improve outcomes for children or students with disabilities and special health care needs. And really we do that under what I like to describe as 4 umbrellas of family support. We're going to talk about the heart and handshake, I think on the next slide, parent-to-parent support. The first aid kit there, that icon, is really meant to signify support and services in helping families understand the systems of care that exist to serve their children, mainly healthcare systems, DDD, Arizona Long-Term Care, our early intervention services, which is actually education related. The book and the apple we'll talk more about in a later slide, special education training and support, and then education and coaching for parents to learn effective methodologies and methods in managing challenging behavior in children. As promised, parent-to-parent support is really the cornerstone of what Raising Special Kids is all about. We started our organization in 1979. That is about 4 years after the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was passed into law. And our services at that time were mainly just parents talking to other parents that had children with disabilities and finding the strength and the power in connecting with another family that had a shared lived experience. So what that looks like today is based off of research, and it's coaching for 8 weeks. It's confidential. We match as much as possible on diagnosis or presenting issue. So if we can't match a family that has the exact same diagnosis, we'll look at what's going on and where that family needs support. We offer, through that program, we offer guidance. It is of no charge to families. It's available in Spanish and English. It's monitored and evaluated at 2, 4, and 8 weeks. And to receive a parent-to-parent connection, families can just call our office or go online and fill out a referral if they just want to talk to another family that's raising a child that's like theirs. We find it especially helpful in times of new diagnosis, also in times of transition, when families may not know what to expect. Raising Special Kids is Arizona's parent training and information center, and we provide special education training, individual assistance at no cost to families of children who have disabilities from birth through high school. Technically, our age range is birth to 26, and we also provide services to youth and young adults who have disabilities themselves. Every state has at least one PTI, or Parent Training and Information Center, and we are that for the state of Arizona. So talk a little bit more about our services as an organization. Training, information, and resources. When COVID-19 hit in the middle of March, I think like every other organization on this panel and folks out there, we scrambled to bring our services online to the greatest extent possible to continue to reach families. We believe that families raising children with disabilities or special health care needs are already isolated because of the nature of the disability. COVID-19 served to, I think, possibly isolate us even more, certainly physically. So we developed a special website page for COVID-19 resources. And I was actually discussing this earlier with a colleague that, the resources that live on that page are not traditional Raising Special Kids resources, but we wanted to be responsive to the needs of the community. So there you'll find a broad range of resources there. We offer online parent training. We have some recorded webinars and training modules also available on our website, and we provide a lot of live online training in formats just like this. To look at our training calendar, you can go to that website. We've also been developing and running weekly Facebook Live chats for parents and families. We've had guests from the Department of Education, from other partner organizations attend our Facebook Lives and some of our training speaker series. So if you would like to connect with our organization, certainly going online, signing up for our e-newsletter is a good start. Also following us on social media could be useful. I'd like to talk a little bit about the individual assistance we offer families, kind of that one-on-one support with a family support specialist. As I was thinking about this, I kind of bolded some words there, and I'd like to kind of run through that first. So strategies, skill development, training, information, options, assistance, and support. That is really what our role is as a information and training center. We provide families with strategies on how to communicate, how to collaborate with schools, build their skills in solving problems, not only with schools, but with home and community-based service providers, case managers, support coordinators. We do a number of different trainings on the rights and responsibilities under IDEA, both Part B, which is school-aged special education, but also early intervention services, Part C, birth to 3 population. We work a lot with eligibility and educational placement, providing information to families, making sure they understand what those rights and responsibilities are, and how to advocate for appropriate educational placement and being able to participate in eligibility discussions. We provide a lot of information on informal and formal dispute resolution options. I really appreciated the previous presenters talking about mediation. Absolutely, we're right on board with that, and we encourage informal dispute resolution when at all possible, but certainly recognizing that it's not always possible and that those state complaints and dispute and due process procedures are sometimes necessary. We work with many families, getting them prepared for IEP meetings. Again, our philosophy is that parents are a child's first and best advocate, and that they need the high quality resources, information, and training in order to be able to effectively advocate for their child, and also to collaborate with schools and decision-making teams, not only with schools, but with doctors, with case managers, with service providers. There's an asterisk on this slide, meeting attendance. Yes, we do go to IEP meetings. That is our IEP partner service. It's our highest level of support, and it's really an extension of the information and training in order to model effective self-advocacy with decision-making teams. So the name of the service is IEP partner, but it really does expand. It's not only for IEP meetings. We attend other special education meetings. We also attend meetings with families with their home and community-based services and supports as well. So that's a little bit about raising special kids and family support and what we provide. Again, we try to be kind of a one-stop shop to help parents connect with a broader network of support to relieve some of that isolation. And certainly we've been doing a lot of work recently with COVID-19, as all of us are a little bit more isolated than we used to be. But in thinking about distance learning and what we all experienced March through May of 2020, you know, we had reports from families that were of varied experiences. We heard successes and we heard of challenges. We heard behavior skills improved. We heard that behavior skills regressed. We heard that academics improved, and we heard that academics regressed. So it was really the full gamut of responses to distance learning and how individual schools and teachers really worked with families. When we kind of boiled down that information, successes, you know, were attributed to practices rooted in parent and professional communication, attitude, and effort. So what we saw, and I really appreciated the common thread of communication throughout this presentation as well. What we saw is that was a key indicator for success. When parents reported that they had great communication or effective communication with their child's teacher and team, they generally had more successful outcomes with distance learning. And an attitude and effort, certainly I think teachers and families going in partnership with the attitude of wanting to make this work was helpful, and then actually putting in the effort to make it happen. And again, you know, certainly this is these successes they illustrated partnerships. So we did absolutely hear of families that had great attitude and effort and even communication, but did not have a good experience. But the successes that we did hear about, typically those three things were present. And then I wanted to provide a little bit of perspective here too on really an unknown future. And I'm really looking forward to next week's presentation with leaders of LEAs talking about what their reopening plans are going to look like. I myself have a 13-year-old child going into the 8th grade, and you know, we're not quite so sure what things are going to look like next year either. I appreciated the conversation on socialization and what that was going to look like, and we too, our son has autism, and we're very much looking forward to seeing what next week brings. So the IEP, I wanted to touch on a few things. So the individualized education program, or the individual education program, really is to meet the unique needs of the student. And we heard that before with Angela and Lori's discussion, and also with Amanda's. And it's developed collaboratively by a team of people, including the parent. So that's the IEP. And the intent has always been individualized supports and services for students who have disabilities. And it's right in the name of the law, right? Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So what we're looking at and what we experienced were large scale structural changes to education in general, as we have known it for years and years, how we experienced it as children. But we see, I put virtually no change to the IDEA, but I've learned from this presentation that absolutely no change to the IDEA has happened. So, you know, I think there might be an opportunity here for families and schools and teachers to really realize the full intent of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as it was always intended to be individualized to the student. And in the midst of these really large structural changes and making decisions on how we're going to go back to school, these individualized decisions are going to be just that much more important. And I'll just echo my colleagues. We would encourage families to communicate early, communicate often. You know, a lot of the communication and collaboration skills and problem-solving skills you can absolutely learn as families through contacting our organization or really any of the organizations on here. I also want to thank Cynthia and Alexis. Alexis, thank you so much for bringing the BIE discussion to this table. Arizona has 53 BIE schools. And, you know, we do serve as a parent training and information center. We serve all families in the state, and we do work with families that have children in the BIE system. So that, I believe, is all I have. I would just like to say thank you from Raising Special Kids. And Kathy, I hope I caught us up. That's our contact information, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. You certainly did. We've just got a couple of things and then we'll end for you. Right now, Nick is going to put 2 links into the chat for the evaluation, one for English and one for Spanish. So please click on the link and let us know what you thought about today. And if for some reason you can't do that today, then when you get the follow-up email, those links will be in there as well. Session 3, you've heard from several people, is next Thursday, July the 2nd from 3 to 5. And at that session, we will be having representatives from ADE, ESS, again, Arizona Department of Education, who will be talking to you about the task force guidance that the Arizona Department of Education gave to all the districts and the charters in the state. And then we will have 6 districts and charters tell you what their plans look like for them. So we're also going to put in the chat right now, and Nick did it just a little bit earlier, how to register for next week, because you do need to do that. If you had any questions about anything that was shared today, or you need individual assistance regarding your child's IEP, please feel free to reach out to us at Raising Special Kids at 800-237-3007. We're open 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. We're happy to take your calls. And I also, Chris was telling you that we do online workshops. And this morning, we scheduled an IEP workshop for next Wednesday, July the 1st from 10 a.m. to noon. Just go to our website, raisingspecialkids.org, and register. We talk about the sections of the IEP in depth, what should happen at the meeting, special ed eligibility, all that type of thing in that workshop. So I needed to put the plug in. Thank you to all of our presenters for the incredible information that you shared today, and we hope to see everybody on next week's call.